Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a really dark, fascinating chapter of history, investigating how an earthly New World paradise flipped into a literal nightmare of survival. When the very first English settlers established Jamestown back in 1607, they were promised this land of endless bounty, an absolute utopia. And yet, just 2 years later, the colony spiraled into a period of starvation so severe and so gruesome that it nearly wiped the entire settlement right off the map. To really wrap our heads around this, we actually aren't starting in the 1600s. We're jumping back just a bit to 2012, during an excavation of a 1608 James Fort cellar. Now, by 1610, this cellar had essentially been turned into a refuse pit. Archaeologists working on the Jamestown Rediscovery Project were digging through all these discarded animal bones and food remains, and they made a discovery that finally put to rest some of the darkest rumors in early American history.
The forensic reality they unearthed was just chilling. They found the mutilated skull and a severed leg bone of a 14-year-old English girl who the researchers named Jane. Dr. Douglas Owsley, a forensic anthropologist at the Smithsonian, took a look and determined that her skull bore very clear chop marks from at least 3 different sharp-edged metal tools. So this wasn't an accident. It was a highly concerted effort to separate soft tissue and the brain from the bone itself. This discovery was a huge deal because it provided the very first forensic proof of survival cannibalism at any early European colony in North America.
Which obviously begs a pretty staggering question. How exactly does a colony, established in a land famously described as an earthly paradise, with abundant wildlife and fruitful soil, descend into such horrific, unthinkable desperation?
Well, let's look at our first major factor, Smith leaving and Percy struggling. We have to look at a drastic shift in leadership that went down in the fall of 1609. Let's compare these two administrations because it's night and day. You had Captain John Smith, a hardened soldier who enforced incredibly strict discipline. His golden rule was simple: he that will not work shall not eat. He basically forced the colonists, many of whom were upper-class gentlemen completely unaccustomed to manual labor, to actually get out there and build, farm, and trade. But after Smith was severely injured in a gunpowder accident and had to sail back to England, leadership fell into the lap of George Percy. Percy was physically sick, historians actually suspect he suffered from epilepsy, and he seriously struggled to keep the men in line.
So the guy inheriting this mounting disaster was just wholly unprepared. If you read Percy's own writings, specifically his True Relation, he essentially admits his profound inability to manage the colony. Without Smith's iron grip, discipline just vanished overnight. Percy wrote about dangerous mutinies, guys stealing from the rapidly shrinking food stores, and colonists straight up abandoning the fort out of pure desperation.
This massive leadership vacuum sets the stage for the anatomy of a complete collapse. It wasn't just one thing, it was a perfect storm.
Multiple disasters hit these people at exactly the same time. The colonists were trapped inside the fort by a brutal siege led by Native American chief Powhatan. This meant anyone who tried to leave to forage or hunt was almost certainly killed. Meanwhile, inside the fort, thousands of rats are devouring what little grain they have left, and a lot of the remaining corn was just rotting away. Throw in contaminated drinking water causing widespread illness, plus a population of indentured servants and wealthy gentlemen who lacked even the most basic survival skills, you've got a surefire recipe for total catastrophe.
It's also super fascinating to look at this from an economic and structural perspective. Analysts, like those at the Cato Institute, point out that Jamestown operated on a communal property structure. Basically, this was a system where everyone contributed to a common store regardless of how hard they personally worked. According to writer Tom Bethel, this completely removed the individual incentive to work hard. Without the direct reward of their own labor, a lot of the colonists became indolent, which just poured gasoline on the fire of their rapidly depleting supplies.
With leadership failing, the food stores ruined, an economic structure offering zero motivation, and the fort under violent siege, we hit the desperate winter of 1609 to 1610. And the numbers from this winter are just staggering. They started the season with over 500 colonists packed into Jamestown. By the time spring rolled around, that population had plummeted to just 60 emaciated survivors. That is nearly a 90% mortality rate in a matter of a few months.
The descent into starvation was systematic and it was devastating. First, they consumed all their horses and livestock. Once those were gone, they made shift with vermin: dogs, cats, rats, mice, you name it.
When the animals were completely depleted, Percy's own accounts say they ate their leather boots and shoes and scoured the woods for snakes. Finally, as famine set in and things looked incredibly grim, they turned to the unthinkable. John Smith, writing later about the events he heard had transpired after he left, detailed some genuinely grotesque acts of absolute desperation. He recorded that one man actually murdered his own wife, powdered or salted her flesh, and ate part of her before he was finally discovered and executed. Smith grimly noted that he had never heard of such a dish as powdered wife.
Now, if you're thinking Smith was maybe just exaggerating for dramatic effect, George Percy, who was actually there on the ground, corroborates the horror. His harrowing account confirms that the sheer extremity of hunger drove the colonists to dig up dead corpses directly out of their graves and consume them just to keep themselves alive.
And remember, the treacherous, swampy landscape surrounding Jamestown meant that leaving the fort was just as deadly as staying inside. Desperate attempts to trade with the Powhatan and the surrounding territories ended in brutal slaughter. Percy writes about sending Captain Ratcliffe out to negotiate. Ratcliffe was ambushed, captured alive, bound naked to a tree, and literally had his flesh scraped from his bones with mussel shells by Powhatan's women before being thrown into a fire. For these colonists, there was truly, absolutely no escape.
But just as the colony was teetering on the brink of being totally erased from history, an unexpected arrival changed the course of everything. Let's look at their salvation and the legacy of this near erasure.
In May 1610, the newly arrived interim governor Thomas Gates took one look at the horrifying state of the 60 survivors and immediately ordered the complete abandonment of Jamestown. They literally packed up and started sailing down the James River to leave for good. But then, on June 10, 1610, in this crazy twist of pure fate, they intercepted Lord De Lawar's relief fleet sailing right up the river. De Lawar brought fresh supplies, 150 brand new settlers, and ordered everyone to turn right back around.
But returning wasn't a return to the old ways. The profound, unimaginable trauma of the starving time led to the immediate implementation of the laws divine, moral, and martial. These were draconian, military-style laws designed specifically to ensure that a collapse of this magnitude could absolutely never happen again.
These new laws were entirely unforgiving. We're talking the death penalty for unauthorized trading with the Native Americans, death penalty for stealing even a tiny bit of food, or killing livestock without permission. Tools were locked away tight. Work hours were strictly regimented by the beating of a drum. Even a baker trying to save a little flour on the side faced severe punishment. The sheer trauma they had just endured birthed a culture of absolute extreme control.
And over time, this near-death experience spurred an economic evolution too. The colony eventually shifted away from that communal store system we talked about earlier and moved toward a system of private property. Colonist John Rolfe, who you might know from marrying Pocahontas, noted that once private property was instituted, men could finally engage in gathering and reaping the fruits of their own labors with much joy and comfort, which fundamentally boosted the colony's productivity and overall morale.
Which leaves us with a pretty compelling final thought. When you consider the immense suffering, the strict martial law, and the stark economic shifts that followed, you have to wonder, was the unimaginable horror of the starving time, the starvation, the cannibalism, the sheer desperation, was all of that the dark, necessary crucible required to forge the harsh, resilient foundation of early America? It's a heavy question to ponder, for sure, but understanding this grim chapter is absolutely essential to understanding the grit that shaped the New World. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope it gave you some fascinating insights into our history.